Chapter 12. Seventh year of the war. Occupation of Pylos. Surrender of the Spartan army in Sphacteria. Next summer, about the time of the corn's coming into ear, 10 Syracusan and as many Locrian vessels sailed to Messina in Sicily, and occupied the town upon the inhabitants, and Messina revolted from the Athenians. The Syracusans contrived this chiefly because they saw that the place afforded an approach to Sicily, and feared that the Athenians might hereafter use it as a base for attacking them with a larger force. The Locrians, because they wished to carry on hostilities from both sides of the strait, and to reduce their enemies, the people of Rhegium. Meanwhile, the Locrians had invaded the Rhegian territory with all their forces to prevent their succoring Messina, and also at the instance of some exiles from Rhegium who were with them. The long factions by which that town had been torn, rendering it for the moment incapable of resistance, and thus furnishing an additional temptation to the invaders. After devastating the country, the Locrian land forces retired, their ships remaining to guard Messina, while others were being manned for the same destination to carry on the war from thence. About the same time, in the spring, before the corn was ripe, the Peloponnesians and their allies invaded Attica under Agis, the son of Archidamus, king of the Lacedaemonians, and sat down and laid waste the country. Meanwhile, the Athenians sent off the 40 ships which they had been preparing to Sicily, with the remaining generals Eurymedon and Sophocles, their colleague Pythodorus having already preceded them thither. These had also instructions as they sailed by to look to the Corcyraeans in the town, who were being plundered by the exiles in the mountain. To support these exiles, 60 Peloponnesian vessels had lately sailed, it being thought that the famine raging in the city would make it easy for them to reduce it. Demosthenes also, who had remained without employment since his return from Acarnania, applied and obtained permission to use the fleet, if he wished it, upon the coast of Peloponnese. Off Laconia, they heard that the Peloponnesian ships were already at Corcyra, upon which Eurymedon and Sophocles wished to hasten to the island, but Demosthenes required them first to touch at Pylos and do what was wanted there before continuing their voyage. While they were making objections, a squall chanced to come on and carried the fleet into Pylos. Demosthenes at once urged them to fortify the place, it being for this that he had come on the voyage, and made them observe there was plenty of stone and timber on the spot, and that the place was strong by nature, and together with much of the country round unoccupied. Pylos, or Coryphasium, as the Lacedaemonians call it, being about 45 miles distant from Sparta, and situated in the old country of the Messenians. The commanders told him that there was no lack of desert headlands in Peloponnese if he wished to put the city to expense by occupying them. He, however, thought that this place was distinguished from others of the kind by having a harbor close by, while the Messenians, the old natives of the country, speaking the same dialect as the Lacedaemonians, could do them the greatest mischief by their incursions from it, and would at the same time be a trusty garrison. After speaking to the captains of companies on the subject, and failing to persuade either the generals or the soldiers, he remained inactive with the rest from stress of weather, until the soldiers themselves, wanting occupation, were seized with a sudden impulse to go round and fortify the place. Accordingly, they set to work in earnest, and having no iron tools, picked up stones and put them together as they happened to fit, and where mortar was needed, carried it on their backs for want of hods, stooping down to make it stay on, and clasping their hands together behind to prevent it falling off, sparing no effort to be able to complete the most vulnerable points before the arrival of the Lacedaemonians, most of the place being sufficiently strong by nature without further fortifications. Meanwhile, the Lacedaemonians were celebrating a festival, and also at first made light of the news, in the idea that whenever they chose to take the field, the place would be immediately evacuated by the enemy or easily taken by force. The absence of their army before Athens having also something to do with their delay. The Athenians fortified the place on the land side, and where it most required it, in 6 days, and leaving Demosthenes with 5 ships to garrison it, with the main body of the fleet hastened on their voyage to Corcyra and Sicily. As soon as the Peloponnesians in Attica heard of the occupation of Pylos, they hurried back home. The Lacedaemonians and their king Agis thinking that the matter touched them nearly. Besides, having made their invasion early in the season, and while the corn was still green, most of their troops were short of provisions. The weather also was unusually bad for the time of year, and greatly distressed their army. Many reasons thus combined to hasten their departure and to make this invasion a very short one. Indeed, they only stayed 15 days in Attica. About the same time, the Athenian general Simonides, gathering together a few Athenians from the garrisons and a number of the allies in those parts, took Ion in Thrace, a Mendian colony and hostile to Athens, by treachery, but had no sooner done so than the Chalcidians and Bottians came up and beat him out of it, with the loss of many of his soldiers. On the return of the Peloponnesians from Attica, the Spartans themselves and the nearest of the Perioeci at once set out for Pylos, the other Lacedaemonians following more slowly, as they had just come in from another campaign. Word was also sent round Peloponnese to come up as quickly as possible to Pylos, while the 60 Peloponnesian ships were sent for from Corcyra, and being dragged by their crews across the isthmus of Leucas, passed unperceived by the Athenian squadron at Zacynthus, and reached Pylos, where the land forces had arrived afore them. Before the Peloponnesian fleet sailed in, Demosthenes found time to send out unobserved 2 ships to inform Eurymedon and the Athenians on board the fleet at Zacynthus of the danger of Pylos and to summon them to his assistance. While the ships hastened on their voyage in obedience to the orders of Demosthenes, the Lacedaemonians prepared to assault the fort by land and sea, hoping to capture with ease a work constructed in haste and held by a feeble garrison. Meanwhile, as they expected the Athenian ships to arrive from Zacynthus, they intended, if they failed to take the place before, to block up the entrances of the harbor to prevent them from being able to anchor inside it. For the island of Sphacteria, stretching along in a line close in front of the harbor, at once makes it safe and narrows its entrances, leaving a passage for 2 ships on the side nearest Pylos and the Athenian fortifications, and for 8 or 9 on that next the rest of the mainland. For the rest, the island was entirely covered with wood, and without paths through not being inhabited, and about 1 mile and 5 furlongs in length. The inlets the Lacedaemonians meant to close with a line of ships placed close together, with their prows turned towards the sea. And meanwhile, fearing that the enemy might make use of the island to operate against them, carried over some heavy infantry thither, stationing others along the coast. By this means, the island and the continent would be alike hostile to the Athenians, as they would be unable to land on either. And the shore of Pylos itself, outside the inlet towards the open sea, having no harbor, and therefore presenting no point which they could use as a base to relieve their countrymen, they, the Lacedaemonians, without sea fight or risk, would in all probability become masters of the place, occupied as it had been on the spur of the moment and unfurnished with provisions. This being determined, they carried over to the island the heavy infantry, drafted by lot from all the companies. Some others had crossed over before in relief parties, but these last who were left there were 420 in number, with their helot attendants, commanded by Epidamnus, son of Melobres. Meanwhile, Demosthenes, seeing the Lacedaemonians about to attack him by sea and land at once, himself was not idle. He drew up under the fortification and enclosed in a stockade the galleys remaining to him, of those which had been left him, arming the sailors taken out of them with poor shields made most of them of osier, it being impossible to procure arms in such a desolate place, and even these having been obtained from a 30-oared Messenian privateer, and a boat belonging to some Messenians who happened to have come to them. Among these Messenians were 40 heavy infantry, whom he made use of. Posting most of his men, unarmed and armed, upon the best fortified and strong points of the place towards the interior, with orders to repel any attack of the land forces, he picked 60 heavy infantry and a few archers from his whole force, and with these went outside the wall down to the sea. where he thought that the enemy would most likely attempt to land. Although the ground was difficult and rocky, looking towards the open sea, the fact that this was the weakest part of the wall would, he thought, encourage their ardor, as the Athenians, confident in their naval superiority, had here paid little attention to their defenses, and the enemy, if he could force a landing, might feel secure of taking the place. At this point, accordingly, going down to the water's edge, he posted his heavy infantry to prevent, if possible, a landing, and encouraged them in the following terms. Soldiers and comrades in this adventure, I hope that none of you in our present strait will think to show his wit by exactly calculating all the perils that encompass us, but that you will rather hasten to close with the enemy without staying to count the odds, seeing in this your best chance of safety. In emergencies like ours, calculate. The Leontinese and their allies, with the Athenians, upon this at once turned their arms against the now weakened Messina and attacked, the Athenians with their ships on the side of the harbor, and the land forces on that of the town. The Messenes, however, sallying out with Demotellus and some Locrians who had been left to garrison the city after the disaster, suddenly attacked and routed most of the Leontine army, killing a great number. Upon seeing which, the Athenians landed from their ships and, following on the Messenes in disorder, chased them back into the town, and setting up a trophy, retired to Rhegium. After this, the Hellenes in Sicily continued to make war on each other by land without the Athenians. Meanwhile, the Athenians at Pylos were still besieging the Lacedaemonians in the island, the Peloponnesian forces on the continent remaining where they were. The blockade was very laborious for the Athenians from want of food and water. There was no spring except one in the citadel of Pylos itself, and that not a large one, and most of them were obliged to grub up the shingle on the sea beach and drink such water as they could find. They also suffered from want of room, being encamped in a narrow space. And as there was no anchorage for the ships, some took their meals on shore in their turn, while the others were anchored out at sea. But their greatest discouragement arose from the unexpectedly long time which it took to reduce a body of men shut up in a desert island, with only brackish water to drink, a matter which they had imagined would take them only a few days. The fact was that the Lacedaemonians had made advertisement for volunteers to carry into the island ground corn, wine, cheese, and any other food useful in a siege, high prices being offered and freedom promised to any of the Helots who should succeed in doing so. The Helots accordingly were most forward to engage in this risky traffic, putting off from this or that part of Peloponnese, and running in by night on the seaward side of the island. They were best pleased, however, when they could catch a wind to carry them in. It was more easy to elude the lookout of the galleys when it blew from the seaward, as it became impossible for them to anchor round the island, while the Helots had their boats rated at their value in money and ran them ashore without caring how they landed, being sure to find the soldiers waiting for them at the landing places. But all who risked it in fair weather were taken. Divers also swam in under water from the harbor, dragging by a cord, in skins, poppy seed mixed with honey and bruised linseed. These at first escaped notice, but afterwards a lookout was kept for them. In short, both sides tried every possible contrivance, the one to throw in provisions and the other to prevent their introduction. At Athens, meanwhile, the news that the army was in great distress and that corn found its way into the men in the island caused no small perplexity, and the Athenians began to fear that winter might come on and find them still engaged in the blockade. They saw that the convoying of provisions round Peloponnese would be then impossible. The country offered no resources in itself, and even in summer they could not send round enough. The blockade of a place without harbors could no longer be kept up, and the men would either escape by the siege being abandoned, or would watch for bad weather and sail out in the boats that brought in their corn. What caused still more alarm was the attitude of the Lacedaemonians, who must, it was thought by the Athenians, feel themselves on strong ground not to send them any more envoys, and they began to repent having rejected the treaty. Cleon, perceiving the disfavor with which he was regarded for having stood in the way of the convention, now said that their informants did not speak the truth, and upon the messengers recommending them, if they did not believe them, to send some commissioners to see,
Cleon himself and Theogenes were chosen by the Athenians as commissioners. Aware that he would now be obliged either to say what had already been said by the men whom he was slandering, or be proved a liar if he said the contrary, he told the Athenians, whom he saw to be not altogether disinclined for a fresh expedition, that instead of sending and wasting their time and opportunities, if they believed what was told them, they ought to sail against the men. And pointing at Nicias, son of Niceratus, then general, whom he hated, he tauntingly said that it would be easy, if they had men for generals, to sail with a force and take those in the island, and that if he had himself been in command, he would have done it. Nicias, seeing the Athenians murmuring against Cleon for not sailing now if it seemed to him so easy, and further seeing himself the object of attack, told him that for all that the generals care, he might take what force he chose and make the attempt. At first, Cleon fancied that this resignation was merely a figure of speech, and was ready to go. But finding that it was seriously meant, he drew back, and said that Nicias, not he, was general, being now frightened, and having never supposed that Nicias would go so far as to retire in his favor. Nicias, however, repeated his offer, and resigned the command against Pylos, and called the Athenians to witness that he did so. And as the multitude is wont to do, the more Cleon shrank from the expedition and tried to back out of what he had said, the more they encouraged Nicias to hand over his command, and clamored at Cleon to go. At last, not knowing how to get out of his words, he undertook the expedition, and came forward and said that he was not afraid of the Lacedaemonians, but would sail without taking anyone from the city with him, except the Lemnians and Imbrians that were at Athens, with some targeteers that had come up from Ennis, and 400 archers from other quarters. With these and the soldiers at Pylos, he would within 20 days either bring the Lacedaemonians alive or kill them on the spot. The Athenians could not help laughing at his fatuity, while sensible men comforted themselves with the reflection that they must gain in either circumstance. Either they would be rid of Cleon, which they rather hoped, or, if disappointed in this expectation, would reduce the Lacedaemonians. After he had settled everything in the assembly, and the Athenians had voted him the command of the expedition, he chose as his colleague Demosthenes, one of the generals at Pylos, and pushed forward the preparations for his voyage. His choice fell upon Demosthenes because he heard that he was contemplating a descent on the island. The soldiers, distressed by the difficulties of the position and rather besieged than besiegers, being eager to fight it out, while the firing of the island had increased the confidence of the general. He had been at first afraid, because the island, having never been inhabited, was almost entirely covered with wood and without paths, thinking this to be in the enemy's favor, as he might land with a large force, and yet might suffer loss by an attack from an unseen position. The mistakes and forces of the enemy the wood would in a great measure conceal from him, while every blunder of his own troops would be at once detected, and they would be thus able to fall upon him unexpectedly, just where they please, the attack being always in their power. If, on the other hand, he should force them to engage in the thicket, the smaller number who knew the country would, he thought, have the advantage over the larger who were ignorant of it, while his own army might be cut off imperceptibly, in spite of its numbers, as the men would not be able to see where to succor each other. The Aetolian Dusianster, which had been mainly caused by the wood, had not a little to do with these reflections. Meanwhile, one of the soldiers, who were compelled by want of room to land on the extremities of the island and take their dinners, with outposts fixed to prevent a surprise, suddenly set fire to a little of the wood without meaning to do so, and as it came on to blow soon afterwards, almost the whole was consumed before they were aware of it. Demosthenes was now able for the first time to see how numerous the Lacedaemonians really were, having up to this moment been under the impression that they took in provisions for a smaller number. He also saw that the Athenians thought success important and were anxious about it, and that it was now easier to land on the island, and accordingly got ready for the attempt, sent for troops from the allies in the neighborhood, and pushed forward his other preparations. At this moment, Cleon arrived at Pylos with the troops which he had asked for, having sent on word to say that he was coming. The first step taken by the two generals after their meeting was to send a herald to the camp on the mainland to ask if they were disposed to avoid all risk, and to order the men on the island to surrender themselves and their arms, to be kept in gentle custody until some general convention should be concluded. On the rejection of this proposition, the generals let one day pass, and the next, embarking all their heavy infantry on board a few ships, put out by night, and a little before dawn, landed on both sides of the island from the open sea and from the harbor, being about 800 strong, and advanced with a run against the first post in the island. The enemy had distributed his force as follows. In this first post, there were about 30 heavy infantry. The center and most level part, where the water was held by the main body and by Epidamnus, their commander, while a small party guarded the very end of the island towards Pylos, which was precipitous on the seaside and very difficult to attack from the land, and where there was also a sort of old fort of stones rudely put together, which they thought might be useful to them, in case they should be forced to retire. Such was their disposition. The advanced post, thus attacked by the Athenians, was at once put to the sword, the men barely out of bed and still arming, the landing having taken them by surprise, as they fancied the ships were only sailing as usual to their stations for the night. As soon as day broke, the rest of the army landed, that is to say, all the crews of rather more than 70 ships, except the lowest rank of oars, with the arms they carried, 800 archers and as many targeteers, the Messeni reinforcements, and all the other troops on duty around Pylos, except the garrison on the fort. The tactics of Demosthenes had divided them into companies of 200 more or less, and made them occupy the highest points in order to paralyze the enemy by surrounding him on every side, and thus leaving him without any tangible adversary, plied by those in his rear if he attacked in front, and by those on one flank if he moved against those on the other. In short, wherever he went, he would have the assailants behind him, and these light-armed assailants the most awkward of all, arrows, darts, stones, and slings making them formidable at a distance, and there being no means of getting at them at close quarters, as they could conquer